As the final days of autumn slipped quietly across the medieval countryside, the change of season did not arrive with drama. There was no sudden storm, no violent wind, no rushing urgency to warn villages that winter was near. Instead, it came in a faint, almost invisible shift in the world. A coolness settled into the mornings, not sharp enough to alarm anyone, but clear enough that families noticed it when they stepped outside to begin their daily chores. The cold did not bite. It merely brushed gently against the skin, like a whisper from the months to come in those early hours. Before the sun had gathered its full strength, the land seemed to move more slowly. The trees, losing their last leaves, rustled in a softer rhythm. The earth felt firmer underfoot as the soil cooled, and the sky hung heavier, its colors muted, as though even the light had grown lazy in preparation for the long nights ahead. Families living in small wooden cottages understood these signs the way one understands an old friend's habits. Winter was not an enemy, only a season to respect. And respect came through preparation done patiently, little by little. Long before the cold reached its depth on these early cold mornings, villagers stepped outside to examine their homes with unhurried attention. They checked the wooden planks of their cottage walls, looking for gaps that might let in drafts. They pressed gently on the roof. Thatch never rushed, never forceful, feeling for weak spots that might leak under snow. Repairing one area might take an entire morning, yet the pace never changed. No one moved quickly. Haste itself seemed out of place in the stillness of the season. The preparation was a ritual, older than memory, shaped by the awareness that winter always rewarded calm, steady care. Even the wind had a different character. During summer, the wind carried warmth and distant farm sounds. But now, it carried the soft crackle of dry leaves and the occasional call of birds preparing to migrate. The villagers listened to these sounds as naturally as listening to their own breathing. Each sound signaled small reminders: collect more straw for bedding, gather wood for the hearth, seal the cellar well. These reminders were not urgent. They were simply part of nature's slow communication. Families often worked together outside the home during these early preparation days. Older members adjusted wooden shutters, while younger ones gathered loose sticks and branches blown down from past winds. Children, although they moved with more energy, still mirrored the quietness of the season. Their laughter was softer, their steps slower, as though even they sensed the changing mood of the land around them. The work they did, however small, carried meaning. A single handful of twigs contributed to the winter's fire. A single stone placed near the cottage wall helped protect the foundation from frost. Nothing was wasted, for everything had a purpose. As the sun finally lifted above the trees, its light felt distant, pale, almost reluctant. It warmed the air only slightly, just enough to soften the chill. In this dim warmth, families continued their early inspections, checking tools, mending baskets, organizing what little supplies they had stored from the last harvest. Tools were not polished for beauty, but examined for function. Handles reinforced, blades secured, ropes checked for fraying. These tasks were repetitive but deeply familiar, forming a rhythm as natural as breathing. The villagers knew that once the nights grew long, these tools might determine whether a task could be done easily, or if it could not be done at all. Inside the cottage, 2 small preparations began. Herbs drying near the hearth were checked to ensure they had not gathered moisture. Clay pots storing grains were tapped lightly to confirm they remained sealed. Stacks of fabric horn, patched and repatched again, were brought out and folded neatly. These fabrics would serve as bedding, wrapping, insulation, and sometimes even makeshift door coverings when the wind grew harsh. Each piece had its own history. A blanket passed through generations, a rough wool sheet traded months earlier, a stitched cloth made by someone now long gone. Perhaps the most telling sign of early winter preparation was the way families began spending a little more time indoors. Not because the weather demanded it yet, but because there was comfort in the routine of slowly readying the home for the season of cold. They swept corners where dust gathered, rearranged stools and benches to make more space around the hearth, and ensured that the hearth itself was clean and ready for the first serious fire of winter. These movements were not hasty, but gentle, almost meditative, as though each action brought the family one step closer to a quiet, safe winter. And so, with each slow step, each soft breath, and each small task performed with patient care, medieval families welcomed the first breath of cold, knowing it was merely winter's polite knock at the door, reminding them that the long nights were approaching. As the air settled into its steady late autumn coolness, medieval families turned their attention toward the most valuable work of early winter: preparation, storing the last remnants of the harvest. Unlike the abundant activity of midsummer or the busy gatherings of autumn's peak season, this phase of preparation moved at a slower, quieter pace. There were no bustling fields, no rush to gather ripened crops before they spoiled. What remained now was humble small vegetables left clinging stubbornly to the soil, herbs drying in their final fragrant breaths, and the modest leftovers of gardens tended through months of patient labor. The fields, which once carried rows of green life, now appeared almost bare. Long brown stalks leaned warily, their growth cycles completed. Yet medieval families knew that even this stage held hidden value. They walked through the fields thoughtfully, eyes trained to notice what others might overlook. A lone cabbage still firm in the cold earth, a cluster of turnips half buried in soil, or even wilted leaves that could still add body to winter stoozle were gathered with the same slow, steady hands that had tended them throughout the year. Mothers and fathers bent down together, gently loosening the earth with simple wooden tools. The ground was cooler now, firmer, yet still willing to give up its final treasures. Each vegetable lifted from the soil carried a meaning that went beyond its size. There was comfort in knowing it would join the household stores, adding just a little more security to the long months ahead. In a time when scarcity was a normal companion, even one extra turnip could ease a family's quiet worry. Back near the cottages, herbs hung along the walls, swaying lightly in the faint breeze. Their colors had faded from summer brightness into muted browns and greens, but their purpose remained strong. Families moved from bundle to bundle, running fingers across dried leaves to check for moisture. If a leaf crumbled gently, it meant the herb had dried well and could be stored safely. If it bent without breaking, it needed another day near the doorway or hearth. This slow, repetitive checking was a routine nearly every household followed, not out of urgency, but out of simple, practiced discipline. Inside the cellar, the cool, shadowed heart of winter storage activity. Medieval cellars were not grand spaces. They were often small rooms carved from earth or built from rough stones. Their ceilings low, their air always cool. Families descended into these quiet spaces with baskets of vegetables, placing each item purposefully on a bed of straw. The straw cushioned the produce and absorbed excess moisture, keeping rot at bay for as long as possible. Root vegetables were arranged not for beauty, but for practicality. Larger turnips were placed at the bottom, smaller ones on top. Cabbages were given space to breathe. Carrots, if the family was fortunate enough to have grown them, were buried in layers of slightly damp sand to preserve their crispness. Clay jars lined one corner, filled with dried beans or grains from earlier months. Families tapped these jars lightly, checking that the wax or fat-sealed coverings remained intact. These checks were silent, but important. Any small crack could mean pests or mold, and in winter even small losses mattered. The cellar atmosphere carried a kind of stillness that encouraged slow movement. Voices naturally softened here. Even children, who normally chattered loudly, spoke in hushed tones, as if the food itself required respect. Some families placed small cloths over particularly delicate items. Others tied bundles of herbs together and hung them overhead, letting their scents drift gently through the cool space. The cellar was not only a storage room, it was a quiet reassurance that the family had done what they could to prepare outside. Drying racks held leftover grains and small slices of meat. These were not luxury foods, but modest supplies meant to stretch through difficult times. Medieval families understood the value of preserving even small amounts. A few dried beans added texture to a stew. A small strip of dried meat could flavor porridge. Throughout these tasks, there was no tension, just patient, practiced movements, lifting, sorting, stacking, checking, performed with the calm acceptance that winter was simply another season to meet with steady hands. In some homes, elders supervised the storage work, offering guidance shaped through decades of winters. Their eyes, sharpened by experience, noticed subtle details, a damp patch on the cellar floor that needed more straw, a jar lid not sealed firmly enough, or a vegetable that would spoil sooner and should be cooked within days. Elders spoke slowly, their voices carrying the rhythm of many winters survived before. Their presence alone brought a sense of comfort, a reminder that preparation was as much tradition as necessity. As daylight faded earlier each day, the family often ended their harvest storing tasks just as the sky deepened into gray. They climbed from the cellar, brushed soil from their hands, and stepped into the cool air with a sense of steady accomplishment. Not pride. Medieval life rarely encouraged that, but quiet reassurance. The last harvest was not plentiful, but it was theirs. It was enough to begin the winter with a measure of peace. And so, by the time the first real frost settled across their land, medieval families had tucked away every vegetable, every herb, and every small scrap nature had offered. Their stores reflected the slow, thoughtful work of countless hands, all guided by the simple understanding that survival came not from abundance, but from preparation done with patience. As the final traces of autumn slipped quietly from the land, the work of preparing the animals for winter began. In medieval life, livestock were not simply possessions. They were companions in survival. offering milk, wool, eggs, and labor through the year. Yet, as winter approached, they too required thoughtful preparation. Families understood that animals felt the cold just as people did, and so each creature received the same slow, patient care that the home itself had been given. The morning air grew sharp, enough to encourage the animals to huddle closer together. Sheep gathered near the wooden fences, their breaths forming faint clouds in the chill. Cows stood quietly in the pasture, shifting their weight slowly, as though the stiffness of cold earth had already begun to seep into their bones. Chickens moved in short, feathery bursts, their bodies fluffing instinctively to conserve warmth. Even the family dog, usually lively, walked with a calmer pace through the frost-tipped grass. Medieval families began by clearing the paths leading to barns and shelters. This task was simple yet essential. A path cluttered with fallen branches or slippery with frost became dangerous during the darker months, when mornings and evenings blurred into long stretches of dimness. Helpers, young and old, moved slowly along the walkways, gathering sticks, smoothing earth, and placing stones where the ground dipped. The rhythm of their movement matched the quietness of the season: gentle footsteps, occasional soft conversations, and the steady thump of wood being stacked against the barn wall. Inside the barns, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The smell of hay mixed with the earthy scent of animals created a comforting warmth. Families brought in fresh straw, spreading it carefully across the floors in thick, even layers. They worked with calm deliberation, smoothing the bedding with their hands, ensuring there were no cold patches that might make the animals restless in the night. Sheep were guided inside earlier than usual, encouraged by soft claps and murmured instructions. The sheep followed slowly, their wool brushing against one another with a faint rustling sound that blended with the barn's gentle stillness. Chickens required a different kind of preparation. Their small wooden coops were checked for gaps that winter winds might exploit. Families used leftover straw and bits of cloth to fill these spaces, pressing them gently into the cracks until even the thinnest draft disappeared. The nesting boxes were refreshed with clean straw, and the wooden floor scraped of remnants from the warmer months. A simple lantern often hung from a nail outside the coop, ready to provide a bit of warmth and light on especially cold nights. Cows and goats needed stronger shelter. They were led into larger barns, where they could stay close together for warmth. Families checked the water troughs, aware that in winter they would freeze quickly. To prepare, they cleaned the troughs thoroughly and positioned them near areas where the warmth from animal bodies or the small barn lantern might slightly delay the freezing. Though this bought little time, medieval people cherished even the smallest advantage against winter's grip. Around the farmyard, fences were also inspected. Winter winds could be fierce, and damaged fences might let animals wander into deep snow or lose their way in the early darkness. Families tightened loose rope, hammered weak posts deeper into the ground, and wove branches between slats to create makeshift windbreaks. These tasks were not glamorous. They were practical, repetitive, and slow. But each action added another layer of safety to the coming months. The soundscape of preparation was gentle, the soft scrape of straw being moved, the slow thud of a mallet tapping a post, the tired clucking of chickens settling into their newly arranged coop. the faint bleating of sheep adjusting to their warmer bedding. Every sound blended into a quiet harmony, turning the farm's surroundings into a place of calm readiness. As midday light softened across the sky, families paused to share a simple meal outdoors, a piece of bread, maybe a ladle of broth, or some dried fruit saved from summer. They sat on overturned barrels or leaned against the barn walls, watching the animals move peacefully in their winter-ready spaces. There was comfort in seeing each creature sheltered, fed, and calm. Medieval winters were long, and yet these early preparations gave families a sense of control. However small, before dusk, families checked the woodpile one last time. Although firewood belonged more to household preparation, it was also important for the animals, especially if a lantern or small heat source was used in the barns. They arranged the stacks neatly, sheltering them with simple boards to shield them from moisture. These small precautions, though humble, formed the backbone of medieval winter survival. As the sun slipped behind the trees, a chilly silence settled across the farm. Animals that had roamed freely in summer now stayed close to their shelters. Their movements grew slower, their sounds softer, mirroring the gentle stillness that winter always brought. Families, too, moved back toward their cottages, satisfied with the day's work. The animals were ready. The surroundings were safe, and with each careful task completed, one more step toward winter's quiet embrace had been taken. As winter crept closer, the heart of medieval preparation shifted steadily toward one essential element: firewood. Fire was the quiet center of survival, its glow warming stiff hands, its smoke cooking the simplest meals, and its embers keeping the long winter nights bearable. But fire could only exist if the wood was ready, dry, and abundant. And so, as the last traces of autumn loosened their grip, families moved into the slow, deliberate ritual of collecting wood, a task older than any memory and more reliable than any tool. The gathering did not begin with urgency. In a medieval village, nothing about winter preparation was rushed. Instead, it started with the same calm acknowledgement that shaped so much of their life. Winter was coming, and firewood would be needed. Families rose early, stepping into the crisp morning air, where breaths drifted like faint clouds. Dew clung to the grass, turning each blade into a tiny, shimmering needle of cold. The sky held the pale softness of early winter light, a reminder that daylight was shrinking with each passing day. Men, women, and children walked toward the forest edge with quiet purpose. They carried simple tools, wooden-handled axes, rope bundles, and dull but dependable saws. No one spoke loudly. The forest in late autumn always felt like a place between seasons, to bear to feel alive, yet not quite asleep. Fallen leaves covered the ground in thick patches, crackling softly under each step. Those crackles echoed in the stillness, forming a slow rhythm that guided their movements deeper into the trees. Firewood, gathering in medieval life, did not mean cutting down fresh trees unless absolutely necessary. Fresh wood held too much moisture, hissing loudly and smoking heavily when burned. Instead, families sought fallen branches, dead trunks leaning quietly against healthier trees, and wood that had already begun drying in nature's long patience. They walked slowly, searching with trained eyes for the right texture and color. Wood that felt solid but not damp, light enough to lift but sturdy enough to burn through a long night when a suitable branch was found. Fathers or older sons gently tested its weight before lifting it. The sound of wood being gathered was soft. A light thump as a branch hit the ground. The rustle of rope being unwound. The measured chop of an axe into a rotting trunk. Each sound spread calmly across the forest, never disturbing the natural quiet of the season. Even children helped in their own small way, carrying twigs for kindling. Their little hands turning the task into a slow and steady game. As the piles of wood grew, families began tying them into bundles. The rope was looped carefully, crossed gently, and tightened slowly to avoid snapping. The bundles were rarely neat, but always functional. Some were carried on backs. Others were dragged along the forest path, leaving shallow trails in the fallen leaves. The work was heavy, yet no one rushed. They moved at the speed the season encouraged, steady, thoughtful, unhurried. When they returned to the village, the next task began: sorting. The yard around each cottage became a calm landscape of wood piles. Thick logs were placed in one area, long enough to burn through cold nights. Medium pieces were placed nearby to keep the fire steady. Smaller twigs and thin branches formed a third pile, perfect for kindling fires on mornings when frost made everything feel too still to spark easily. Families built their piles with gentle precision, forming small walls of wood that curved around the side of the cottage or stood under simple wooden shelters. Stacking wood was its own quiet ritual. Each piece was placed carefully to allow air to circulate, keeping the wood dry. Families spaced the logs with the kind of slow, thoughtful rhythm that made the work feel almost meditative. The piles grew steadily, becoming silent markers of the coming season. A neatly stacked woodpile brought a sense of reassurance, its shape promising countless warm evenings by the hearth. As the days grew colder, families inspected their woodpiles often. They checked for signs of moisture, rearranged pieces that looked too damp, and added fresh straw or old cloth over the top to shield them from early snow. In some homes, children were asked to knock gently on the wood with small sticks. A hollow sound meant the piece was dry. A dull thud suggested it needed more time. This small task made the children feel important, as though winter preparation depended on their listening skills. Meanwhile, the forest continued to shed branches as wind and cold nudged its weary trees. Families made several trips each week, each journey adding another layer of security to their stores. Even elderly members participated by sharpening axes, braiding rope, or simply sitting near the woodpile to ensure chickens or wandering goats didn't pick at it out of curiosity. By the time the last leaves clung stubbornly to their branches, the firewood piles stood tall. They were not perfect. Some pieces were uneven, some bundles loosely tied, some logs still slightly damp, but they represented the slow, honest work of hands that understood the rhythm of the world. The families did not ask for more. They simply respected what nature had given and arranged it with patience into a promise of warmth. As frost gently dusted the village roofs for the first time, medieval families looked at their firewood stores with quiet satisfaction. Winter could come whenever it wished. They had prepared with steady hands and calm hearts. After the long, steady work of gathering firewood from the forest, medieval families turned their attention to a quieter but equally important task: ensuring the wood was ready to burn. Firewood did not serve its purpose simply by being collected. It needed to be dried, split, and seasoned with care, treated almost like a humble companion that would carry them through the long, cold months ahead. And so, with the slow rhythm of early winter guiding their movements, families began the gentle process of preparing each piece of wood for its future life in the hearth. The yard around the cottage became a space of calm activity. Even as the cold air pressed softly against the skin, families worked with a patient steadiness, never rushing. The air carried the faint, woody scent of fresh bark mixed with the coolness of morning frost. Wood piles cast long shadows across the ground as the low winter sun moved slowly through the sky. Everywhere, there was a quiet sense of readiness. The first step was sorting the collected wood more carefully. Thick branches were separated from thin ones, heavy logs from hollow pieces, and fresh-cut trunks from long-dead fallen limbs. Each type of wood had its use. Larger logs burned longer and steadier, carrying the family through the deepest winter nights. Smaller pieces caught flame quickly, perfect for beginning the day's fire. Families knelt beside the piles, picking up each piece, feeling its weight, and listening for the sound it made when tapped lightly. A dry, hollow tone meant the wood was nearly ready. A deeper, denser sound meant it needed more time. Splitting the larger logs was a slow, deliberate ritual. An older member of the family, often a father, older brother, or grandfather, would take up the axe. Medieval axes were simple tools, heavy iron heads affixed to wooden handles, worn smooth by years of use. The person splitting the wood positioned the log upright on a flat stump, took a steady breath, and brought the axe down with calm precision. There was no rushing, no display of strength, only the quiet, practiced motion of someone who understood how the wood wished to break. The sound of splitting wood echoed softly across the village. It was not a sharp noise, but a deep, muffled crack, as though the log were gently opening itself to the coming winter. Children sometimes paused in their chores to watch the splitting, fascinated by how a single, solid piece of wood could fall apart into neat halves. After each strike, the split pieces were gathered by younger hands and carried to a growing pile, where they would continue to dry. Drying the wood properly was essential. Wet or green wood burned poorly, filling the cottage with smoke and wasting precious fuel. Families arranged the split logs under simple wooden shelters, lean-tos, built from rough boards, old planks, or even bundles of thatch supported by stakes. The shelters were open on the sides to let the wind pass through, but covered on top to keep snow and rain from settling on the wood. The logs were stacked loosely, allowing as much air as possible to move between them. Proper airflow was the quiet secret of seasoning firewood. Sometimes, as families worked, a faint breeze would lift the smell of freshly split wood into the air. It was a mild, earthy, scent-reassuring, almost comforting. Medieval families rarely commented on it aloud, but they understood its meaning. It told them the wood was beginning to dry, beginning its slow transformation into the warmth that would later curl through the cottage like a soft, glowing blanket dot. Seasoning the wood took patience. It was not something completed in a single day or even a single week. The process stretched through the early winter, every small shift in the weather contributing to the wood's readiness. On warmer days, The logs released their moisture more easily. On colder days, frost clung to the bark, reminding families that the wood still had work to do before it could serve them fully. Medieval people were used to waiting. They trusted time in a way that modern life rarely allows. During the afternoons, families sometimes sat near the drying wood to do small chores, repairing baskets, mending clothes, or trimming kindling with small knives. It wasn't that the wood needed watching. It was simply that the area around it was peaceful. The stacked logs formed a backdrop of calm, their rough textures catching the light in dull, muted tones. The slow, repetitive work of mending and trimming matched the slow, silent work of the wood itself, both processes unfolding quietly, neither rushed nor interrupted. Children helped by gathering the smallest branches and bark chips that fell during splitting. These would become kindling. They placed them in small cloth bags or wooden boxes, laying them near the hearth indoors. Kindling was precious in winter, for even the driest logs needed help waking into flame on cold mornings. Families treated these scraps with the same care as the largest logs, understanding that warmth came from many small steps, not just one dot. By the time evening settled in, the wood shelter and the piles beneath it glowed softly in the fading light. The logs, now split and carefully arranged, looked almost like sleeping creatures resting before their long service. Families often paused to glance at them before returning indoors, finding quiet comfort in knowing that each piece was slowly becoming ready to burn brightly, ready to give warmth, ready to turn winter from something sharp into something survivable. And as night wrapped itself gently around the village, the slow work of drying, splitting, and seasoning the firewood continued silently, guided only by time, weather, and patience. As winter deepened, medieval families focused not only on firewood and food, but also on the layers of warmth that surrounded them: clothing, blankets, and bedding. In a world without modern insulation or central heating, the body itself became the first line of defense against the cold, and preparing textiles for the season was a quiet, deliberate ritual that stretched from the first frost to the last days before spring. Each item, no matter how simple, played a role in survival, and the slow, repetitive work of maintaining them formed an essential rhythm in daily life. The day often began with inspection. Mothers and daughters, or sometimes fathers, depending on the household, pulled woolen tunics, linen shirts, and thick wool socks from storage. Each garment was carefully examined, turned over in the hands, and checked for signs of wear. Small holes in the elbows, fraying seams, loose threads along edges. Even the smallest tear, if left unattended, could widen in the cold months when the fabric stiffened and the wearer moved frequently. Families approached this work with patience, understanding that a single well-repaired garment might protect its owner from chills or frostbite on particularly harsh nights. Mending itself was slow and methodical. Needles were threaded with strands of wool or linen, sometimes of slightly different colors than the original fabric, and stitches were drawn carefully across worn areas. Some pieces required simple, darning, small, repetitive movements that created a patch almost invisible to the untrained eye. Others needed more deliberate reinforcement, with layers of fabric sewn over weak points. Every movement was performed with attention, almost meditative in its repetition. Children were sometimes given scraps to practice on, their small fingers mimicking the careful motions of their elders, learning a skill that would serve them for a lifetime. Bedding received equal care. Straw-filled mattresses were plumped and rearranged, old blankets shaken to remove dust, and thicker quilts brushed and fluffed to maintain warmth. In homes where extra bedding was scarce, families would layer textiles carefully, using worn tunics or spare linen sheets to create additional warmth. The placement of each layer was deliberate, thicker coverings closest to the sleeper, thinner ones atop for adjustment as the night deepened or the hearth's warmth fluctuated. Medieval families understood the subtle balance between insulation and comfort, and their arrangements reflected years of careful observation. Clothing preparation extended outdoors as well. Cloaks and heavy wool coats, often lined with rough wool or fur, were brushed of dust and snow before being stored or worn. Hoods were checked for tears or frayed edges. Boots, simple and often made from untreated leather, were oiled or dried near the fire to prevent cracking in the cold. These daily rituals were quiet, sometimes solitary tasks, performed in the dim morning light or beside the soft glow of the hearth. The repetition of these movements provided a rhythm to the day that matched the slow, unchanging pace of the season itself. Children played their part, though often in indirect ways. They helped carry clothing to the hearth for drying padded quilts into shape, or held scraps of fabric for sewing. The younger ones learned to notice small details, a hole too large to mend with a simple stitch, a patch that had worn through, or a blanket that needed rearranging before bedtime. Through these small contributions, they became participants in the household's survival, learning that warmth required patience, care, and attention. Some families also took the opportunity to create new garments during this time. Wool, spinning, sewing, and weaving were slow, daily tasks that could take hours to produce even a single item. Spinning wheels or simple hand spindles were used to turn raw wool into yarn, which could then be woven or sewn into garments. Even in the cold, the act of producing new fabric became part of the household's rhythm, quiet, almost hypnotic work that connected them to the cycles of nature and necessity. By evening, all garments and bedding were in their places, repaired and arranged carefully. Tunics were folded and stacked on benches, wool socks paired and lined in small boxes, and quilts layered over sleeping mats or straw-filled mattresses. The hearth glowed gently, illuminating the textures of wool, linen, and fur, highlighting the deliberate care with which each item had been tended. In these quiet moments, families could rest with a sense of reassurance, knowing that the work of preparation extended not only to food and fire, but also to the very fabrics that touched their bodies. And so, the care of clothing and bedding became more than a practical task. It was a ritual that provided structure, comfort, and calm. Through these slow, repetitive movements, medieval families ensured warmth, continuity, and a subtle sense of mastery over the long, harsh months of winter. As winter deepened, medieval families focused not only on firewood and food, but also on the layers of warmth that surrounded them: clothing, blankets, and bedding. In a world without modern insulation or central heating, the body itself became the first line of defense against the cold. And preparing textiles for the season was a quiet, deliberate ritual that stretched from the first frost to the last days before spring. Each item, no matter how simple, played a role in survival, and the slow, repetitive work of maintaining them formed an essential rhythm in daily life. The day often began with inspection. Mothers and daughters, or sometimes fathers, depending on the household, pulled woolen tunics, linen shirts, and thick wool socks from storage. Each garment was carefully examined, turned over in the hands, and checked for signs of wear. Small holes in the elbows, fraying seams, loose threads along edges. Even the smallest tear, if left unattended, could widen in the cold months when the fabric stiffened and the wearer moved frequently. Families approached this work with patience, understanding that a single well-repaired garment might protect its owner from chills or frostbite on particularly harsh nights. Mending itself was slow and methodical. Needles were threaded with strands of wool or linen, sometimes of slightly different colors than the original fabric, and stitches were drawn carefully across worn areas. Some pieces required simple, darning, small, repetitive movements that created a patch almost invisible to the untrained eye. Others needed more deliberate reinforcement, with layers of fabric sewn over weak points. Every movement was performed with attention, almost meditative in its repetition. Children were sometimes given scraps to practice on, their small fingers mimicking the careful motions of their elders, learning a skill that would serve them for a lifetime. Bedding received equal care. Straw-filled mattresses were plumped and rearranged, old blankets shaken to remove dust, and thicker quilts brushed and fluffed to maintain warmth. In homes where extra bedding was scarce, families would layer textiles carefully, using worn tunics or spare linen sheets to create additional warmth. The placement of each layer was deliberate, thicker coverings closest to the sleeper, thinner ones atop for adjustment as the night deepened or the hearth's warmth fluctuated. Medieval families understood the subtle balance between insulation and comfort, and their arrangements reflected years of careful observation. Clothing preparation extended outdoors as well. Cloaks and heavy wool coats, often lined with rough wool or fur, were brushed of dust and snow before being stored or worn. Hoods were checked for tears or frayed edges. Boots, simple and often made from untreated leather, were oiled or dried near the fire to prevent cracking in the cold. These daily rituals were quiet, sometimes solitary tasks, performed in the dim morning light or beside the soft glow of the hearth. The repetition of these movements provided a rhythm to the day that matched the slow, unchanging pace of the season itself. Children played their part, though often in indirect ways. They helped carry clothing to the hearth for drying padded quilts into shape, or held scraps of fabric for sewing. The younger ones learned to notice small details, a hole too large to mend with a simple stitch, a patch that had worn through, or a blanket that needed rearranging before bedtime. Through these small contributions, they became participants in the household's survival, learning that warmth required patience, care, and attention. Some families also took the opportunity to create new garments during this time. Wool, spinning, sewing, and weaving were slow, daily tasks that could take hours to produce even a single item. Spinning wheels or simple hand spindles were used to turn raw wool into yarn, which could then be woven or sewn into garments. Even in the cold, the act of producing new fabric became part of the household's rhythm, a quiet, almost hypnotic work that connected them to the cycles of nature and necessity. By evening, all garments and bedding were in their places, repaired and arranged carefully. Tunics were folded and stacked on benches, wool socks paired and lined in small boxes, and quilts layered over sleeping mats or straw-filled mattresses. The hearth glowed gently, illuminating the textures of wool, linen, and fur, highlighting the deliberate care with which each item had been tended. In these quiet moments, families could rest with a sense of reassurance, knowing that the work of preparation extended not only to food and fire, but also to the very fabrics that touched their bodies. And so, the care of clothing and bedding became more than a practical task. It was a ritual that provided structure, comfort, and calm. Through these slow, repetitive movements, medieval families ensured warmth, continuity, and a subtle sense of mastery over the long, harsh months of winter. Alongside the care of clothing and bedding, medieval families devoted careful attention to the hearth and the small spaces around it. In a time when central heating was unknown, the hearth was both the literal and figurative heart of a home. It provided warmth, a place to cook, a locus of light, and even a subtle sense of reassurance that winter could be endured. Maintaining it was slow, deliberate work, and families performed it with a rhythm that matched the quiet pulse of the season. Mornings often began with cleaning. Ashes from the previous night's fire were swept carefully into small baskets or clay pots, the dust floating faintly in the pale light filtering through narrow windows. This was not hurried labor. It was almost ceremonial. The sweep of the broom, the gentle tilt of the basket, the careful distribution of ashes outside the door were part of a practiced routine. Every action was measured, unhurried, and mindful, as though disturbing the hearth too suddenly might disturb the household itself. Next came inspection. Hearthstones were checked for cracks or soot buildup that might impede proper burning. Iron grates, if present, were brushed clean, and simple hooks and tripods were examined to ensure they could safely hold pots over the flames. Even small wooden surfaces nearby were smoothed, and any stray kindling was stacked neatly for use later. The work was repetitive and slow, each gesture reinforcing the quiet, meditative pace that the cold months demanded. Preparing the fire itself was a ritual of patience. Kindling was gathered from the smaller twigs stored in the yard or cellar, selected for dryness and readiness. Families built small, careful piles in the hearth, arranging each piece so air could circulate and the flame would catch steadily. Only then was a spark introduced, often by friction methods such as flint and steel, or by transferring embers from the previous night's fire. The process was deliberate. Too hasty, and the kindling might fail. Too careless, and smoke would fill the cottage. The flames were coaxed to life slowly, almost as if the fire were a living presence requiring gentle attention and respect. Once the fire burned steadily, attention turned to cooking spaces. Pots, usually clay or iron, were scrubbed gently to remove residue and soot. Families inspected utensils, wooden spoons, ladles, and knives to ensure they were intact and safe for use. Any cracks or loose handles were repaired immediately, often with small strips of cloth or natural adhesives. Even the placement of pots around the hearth was considered thoughtfully, ensuring each dish received the correct level of heat. Broths, porridge, and stews simmered slowly, releasing faint, earthy aromas into the cottage. The smell, while simple, carried comfort and reassurance, signaling that the household was protected from both hunger and cold in larger homes. Separate cooking areas near the hearth were often tidied as well. Work surfaces were cleared, mortars and wooden boards scrubbed, and leftover scraps organized for preservation. Families understood that a clean and orderly space allowed for easier management of daily meals and minimized waste. Children often assisted in these quiet tasks, stirring thickening stews, lifting small bundles of herbs, or carrying water from wells or small basins. Their movements were slow and deliberate, and through repetition, they learned the rhythm of domestic care in winter. Maintenance was ongoing. Even after meals, ashes were removed, pots cleaned, and embers covered to retain warmth. Families often performed small repairs while the fire burned, patching clothing, reinforcing straw bedding, or mending baskets. Each action, though mundane, connected directly to survival. The hearth was more than a cooking space. It was the center of household continuity, teaching patience, responsibility, and the quiet satisfaction of careful preparation. By evening, the hearth glowed gently, casting long shadows across walls lined with herbs, textiles, and stored food. The soft crackle of embers provided a soothing soundtrack to the household, accompanying hushed conversations, reading of prayers, or gentle storytelling. Families gathered closer, their movements slow and restful, feeling the warmth not only from the fire but from shared labor, repeated routines, and the knowledge that the home was secure against the chill outside. Even in the coldest months, the care of the hearth and cooking spaces created a steady, calming rhythm. Each sweep of ashes, each carefully laid log, each simmering pot reinforced the household's quiet structure. The rhythm became hypnotic, almost meditative, a slow heartbeat of domestic life that marked the passing days, bridged the long nights, and quietly prepared medieval families to endure the remaining stretch of winter. While fire, food, and clothing occupied much of medieval families' attention during winter, another quieter, almost invisible set of routines ensured daily survival, hygiene, and personal care. In a period long before modern plumbing, central heating, or chemical soaps, these tasks were simple, repetitive, and deeply tied to both comfort and the rhythm of the household. Their slow, deliberate practice created an understated sense of order in days that might otherwise have felt unrelenting in cold, darkness, and scarcity. The earliest mornings often began with washing using the most basic supplies available. Water was carried carefully from nearby wells, streams, or rain barrels, usually in wooden buckets. The liquid was cold, often sharp against the skin, yet families accepted this as part of life. Moving slowly to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary exposure to the chill. Hands, faces, and sometimes feet were washed first, accompanied by gentle murmurs or soft words between family members. Children often helped, passing water or carrying small basins, learning the rhythm of daily care in a slow, deliberate manner. Bathing as a full-body ritual was rare in the depths of winter, but small cleansing practices remained essential. Cloths dampened in warm water, were used to wipe exposed skin, and coarse brushes or small bundles of herbs provided both gentle exfoliation and subtle fragrance. Herbs like rosemary, thyme, or sage, previously dried and stored, were sometimes added to water or rubbed directly onto the skin, their faint scents drifting through dimly lit rooms. The act was both hygienic and meditative, slow strokes, repeated gently, establishing a calm, quiet rhythm in the household. Hair care followed a similar, measured pace. Hair was brushed slowly to remove tangles, using wooden combs carved by local craftsmen. Stray hairs were smoothed into braids or tucked under hoods to conserve warmth. The gentle, repetitive motions of untangling, smoothing, and arranging hair were almost hypnotic. In larger homes, older children sometimes assisted younger siblings, carefully replicating the motions they had watched for years. This slow attention not only kept hair neat, but also fostered a subtle sense of responsibility and familial connection. Hands and nails received particular attention, for they bore the brunt of daily labor. Cold, dry winters made skin prone to cracking. Families applied simple ointments made from animal fat, rendered tallow, or herbal mixtures to protect and soothe the hands. Fingers were rubbed gently and nails cleaned slowly, ensuring that the tools of work hands themselves remained ready for the long day ahead. These acts, repeated quietly each morning or evening, were small but meaningful, providing both comfort and continuity in otherwise harsh conditions. Hygiene extended to clothing worn next to the skin. Under tunics and woolen layers, linen garments were washed, dried. In many homes, washing was a slow process, performed in basins or large wooden tubs over the fire. Clothes were rinsed carefully, wrung gently, and hung near the hearth to dry slowly, the heat and smoke lending a faint protective layer to the fibers. Even the smallest tasks, folding, airing, and checking for wear, were performed with patience and methodical repetition, forming a quiet cadence to the household day. Toilet routines, although private, followed a consistent, deliberate pattern. Chamber pots were emptied, cleaned, and stored in designated corners of the home. Simple latrines outside were attended to as needed, the work slow, careful, and respectful of the harsh cold. Every task, no matter how minor, was performed with measured attention. Families understood that maintaining cleanliness and organization, even in small ways, reduced illness, conserved comfort, and preserved the slow, steady flow of winter life. Evenings often included a final round of personal care. Children were wrapped in warm layers, feet checked for dampness, and hair smoothed before bed. Adults repeated similar small rituals, washing hands, rubbing ointments into dry skin, ensuring clothing and bedding were tidy. These routines, gentle and repetitive, carried both practical and psychological weight. They marked the transition from active day to quiet night, providing a subtle comfort that extended beyond the physical act. The steady cadence of preparation and care became a soft rhythm that helped everyone settle into long winter nights, fostering calm, continuity, and reassurance. Through these quiet routines, medieval families reinforced their resilience. Hygiene and personal care were far more than practical necessities. They were part of a daily structure that anchored life, softened the harshness of winter, and connected each member to the household's shared rhythm. Though unremarkable to outsiders, the repetitive care of body, clothing, and environment created a meditative, soothing cadence that allowed families to endure the cold months with quiet endurance and subtle grace. Even in the quietest corners of medieval life, no family existed entirely alone. Villages were small and often clustered around fields, forests, or rivers, and the arrival of winter brought a subtle awareness of interdependence. Families relied not only on their own preparation of food, firewood, and clothing, but also on the quiet assistance of neighbors. This was rarely dramatic or formal. Instead, it manifested in soft, repetitive gestures that blended into the rhythm of daily life, quietly sustaining households through the long, cold months. The earliest signs of communal activity often appeared at the edge of the village or near central gathering points. A neighbor might arrive carrying a bundle of firewood, the rhythmic crunch of their boots on frost-hardened paths blending with the faint bleating of sheep or clucking of chickens. Another might bring surplus food from preserved stores, a few root vegetables, a small piece of smoked meat, or dried herbs carefully wrapped in cloth. These exchanges were never urgent or loud. They were modest gestures performed with soft-spoken words, gentle nods, or quick smiles that conveyed gratitude and acknowledgement. Families frequently assisted each other with labor-intensive chores that became particularly taxing in winter. Men might help repair a neighbor's fence weakened by frost, or carry bundles of wood from forest edges back to homes. Women often visited one another to help prepare food for extended storage, peeling root vegetables, stirring thick porridge, or cleaning and drying herbs for the season ahead. Children, too, played a role, carrying small bundles of twigs, delivering water from shared wells, or helping to arrange bedding in neighbors' homes. These acts, repeated slowly and deliberately, built a subtle rhythm of interdependence that allowed the village to endure collectively. The exchange of knowledge was another quiet form of communal support. Experienced families would share tips on the best ways to preserve root vegetables, treat cloth to withstand frost, or protect livestock from bitter winds. Elders often guided younger villagers, demonstrating slow, methodical techniques that might seem unremarkable, yet were essential for survival. Listening and observing became as important as performing the tasks themselves, as knowledge was passed gently, in repeated demonstrations that were easy to forget, yet hard to ignore when the season demanded it. Even routine visits carried significance. A neighbor dropping by to check on livestock or retrieve a forgotten tool created a subtle web of observation. People noticed slight changes, the way chickens huddled together, the appearance of frost in barns, the condition of firewood piles. These observations allowed families to respond before minor issues escalated into more serious problems. The process was slow and unhurried. Often, it was done without speech, simply through shared presence and quiet attention to details. Social exchanges during winter were minimal but meaningful. If someone prepared extra stew or baked bread, portions might be quietly left at a neighbor's door. A broken tool might be repaired and returned the next day. Even simple gestures, helping to carry water, replacing a straw mattress, or checking on a sick animal strengthened bonds that were otherwise invisible. Medieval villagers understood that survival was rarely achieved in isolation. It was the accumulation of countless small acts, repeated with patience and calm, that carried families through the harshest months. Occasionally, village gatherings occurred, usually near a church or common space, where neighbors shared news or exchanged advice about approaching storms, ice, or shortages. These gatherings were subdued, measured, and deliberate, never boisterous. Conversation was low, voices almost hushed against the background of creaking timber, distant animal sounds, and the occasional muffled footstep on frost-covered paths. The rhythm of interaction mirrored the rhythm of the season itself, slow, steady, and intentional. Even in the home, signs of community influence appeared subtly. Families replicated methods they had seen neighbors use for storing food or preserving clothing. Children imitated small tasks they observed during visits, and parents passed along techniques learned from extended family or fellow villagers. Each gesture was small, almost imperceptible, yet collectively it ensured that the village functioned as a single, resilient entity. The slow cadence of preparation, observation, and repetition created a network of care that was quiet, gentle, and deeply dependable. By evening, after long hours of both domestic work and neighborly assistance, families returned to their hearths with the faint satisfaction of shared survival. The soft glow of the fire reflected not only the warmth of their own preparation, but also the quiet assurance that others in the village had likewise contributed to sustaining life through winter. It was a subtle, almost hypnotic comfort. The knowledge that survival was not only the product of one household's effort, but the combined rhythm of many, working slowly, methodically, and with patience. In the long, cold months of a medieval winter, the quiet act of sharing resources and skills became an essential, almost invisible thread that held the village together. Families lived in modest homes, often separated by narrow paths or open fields, and while each household prepared as best it could, survival depended heavily on small, deliberate exchanges of both material goods and practical knowledge. This sharing was subtle, measured, and repetitive, creating a rhythm as slow and persistent as the frost creeping over window panes, or the low arc of the sun across pale winter skies. One of the most important forms of sharing involved food. Families who had gathered more than enough root vegetables or preserved meats often quietly delivered portions to neighbors who might have had less success or who were struggling with illness or infirmity. These exchanges were rarely announced or celebrated. A small basket of carrots or a bundle of dried herbs might be left near the doorstep, accompanied by a nod or a low-voiced greeting. Such gestures, repeated across days and weeks, formed a gentle network of mutual support that rarely drew attention but ensured the village's quiet endurance. Skill-sharing was equally significant. Not every family possessed the same expertise in preparing winter stores, repairing tools, or maintaining clothing. Those with experience in weaving, spinning, or mending garments would demonstrate techniques to neighbors, guiding hands slowly through repetitive motions that were easy to imitate but hard to master without patient observation. Likewise, those who understood how to preserve meat, smoke fish, or make simple herbal remedies became informal teachers, passing their knowledge quietly from household to household. These exchanges were methodical, performed with care, and always at a pace dictated by the season, slow, steady, and deliberate. Children played an important, if understated, role in this communal skill sharing. They observed elders at work, imitated small tasks, and occasionally carried supplies or tools between homes. These subtle movements taught them responsibility and the rhythm of village life. And over time, the young learned that even the smallest contribution, a bundle of twigs, a handful of herbs, a correctly rolled loaf of bread, had real significance in sustaining the household network. Each action, though quiet and unhurried, became a thread in the intricate web of winter survival. Tools, too, were shared with care. Families often repaired or sharpened axes, knives, and spades for neighbors, ensuring that everyone could continue to gather wood, till fields, or prepare food. A dull knife could slow meal preparation, just as a broken axe could delay the stacking of firewood. By taking turns repairing tools or offering their expertise, families maintained a subtle balance of labor that prevented small inconveniences from becoming serious hardships. These acts, repeated routinely, formed an invisible rhythm, an unspoken code of neighborly responsibility. The sharing extended to animals and land as well. Livestock might be grazed on a neighbor's land when snow covered a family's own pastures, or small groups of chickens might temporarily roam near a cottage where feed was more abundant. Those with more knowledge in animal husbandry advised others on feeding routines or shelter construction, demonstrating slow, deliberate methods that maximized warmth and survival. The knowledge itself became a shared resource, almost as valuable as firewood or food, quietly reinforcing the resilience of the entire village. Even minor gestures carried meaning. A parent might show a neighbor how to repair a hole in a wool cloak, or a child might deliver a bundle of kindling to a neighbor's hearth. These small, repetitive acts were not done for recognition, but for practical necessity and gentle solidarity. Over the weeks, such exchanges became habitual, forming a patterned rhythm of winter life. They ensured that even families with fewer resources could endure the cold months with dignity and safety. By evening, the cumulative effect of these quiet interactions became evident. Each home, though simple, was supported not only by its own preparation, but by a network of carefully maintained exchanges. The village moved as a collective organism, its rhythm dictated by slow labor, deliberate sharing, and patient observation. Even in the harshest weather, families could rely on one another, if not for abundance, then for consistency, reassurance, and the soft, persistent presence of neighbors quietly attending to the needs of others. This slow, cyclical exchange of resources and skills became an invisible backbone of medieval winter life. The process required patience, humility, and repetition. It created a subtle sense of security, almost hypnotic in its reliability, which allowed families to settle into the cold months with calm endurance, though it might appear unremarkable from a distance. The careful rhythm of sharing material and practical was essential to sustaining life when frost, darkness, and scarcity were constant. As winter reached its full depth, some tasks simply required more than one pair of hands. Even the smallest cottages benefited from collaboration, whether it was carrying firewood, repairing fences, or tending livestock. These cooperative efforts were quiet, unhurried, and repetitive, forming a rhythm that became almost meditative, a shared cadence that helped families endure the harsh months with minimal stress and maximum care. One of the most common joint tasks was managing the household's fuel. Even after chopping, splitting, and drying wood, the sheer volume needed to sustain a fire throughout the day and night demanded cooperation. Men, and occasionally older boys, carried heavy bundles of logs from storage areas to the hearth, coordinating movements to avoid accidents on slippery, frost-laden ground. The work was slow, deliberate, and filled with small adjustments. One person steadied the load, while another positioned logs carefully for stacking, ensuring airflow for efficient burning. Each movement was measured, almost hypnotic, and repeated daily, building a rhythm as predictable and reliable as the sun's low winter. Women often joined together to prepare food in quantities sufficient for multiple families. In the evenings, when daylight waned, neighbors might gather near a single hearth, peeling root vegetables, stirring large pots of porridge, or kneading dough. The work was slow, almost trance-like. Knives rasped against vegetables, wooden spoons stirred thickening stews, and hands kneaded dough with gentle repetition. Children assisted with smaller tasks, such as fetching water or gathering firewood, their movements carefully observed and guided by the elders. Through these quiet, shared actions, households not only prepared sustenance, but also reinforced social bonds, creating a rhythm that defined winter life. Tending animals was another area where collaboration proved essential. Winter storms could make paths slippery and pastures difficult to reach. So families often paired up to transport, feed water, and bedding for livestock. Even the simple act of leading a stubborn goat or sheep into shelter required patience, shared effort, and gentle guidance. Neighbors observed one another's techniques, exchanged advice on feeding schedules, and demonstrated slow, careful handling of animals prone to stress in the cold. Over time, these repeated tasks created a steady pattern, ensuring both safety and warmth for creatures whose survival was intimately tied to human diligence. Repairs and maintenance were also communal. Roofs and fences, exposed to snow and ice, required periodic attention. Villagers often worked together to replace broken thatch, reinforce wooden beams, or mend gates. The work was repetitive, performed with a slow, methodical pace that emphasized precision over speed. Families took turns observing and assisting, learning from one another's methods. Each swing of the hammer, each placement of a thatch bundle, each careful adjustment of a gatepost contributed to a quiet rhythm that defined the winter season, blending labor, learning, and cooperation into a single steady flow. Even leisure activities carried elements of shared routine. When the day's work was done, families occasionally gathered in one home to warm by the hearth, exchange news, or tell stories. Conversation was soft, almost hushed, punctuated by the gentle crackling of embers and the occasional murmur of approval or laughter. Children might retell minor events, such as small discoveries in the snow, while adults shared observations about crops, livestock, or household management. These gatherings were never hurried or loud. They reflected the rhythm of the day, steady, predictable, and restorative. These collective routines had practical and emotional significance. By performing labor together, families ensured that the work could be completed efficiently, that resources were conserved, and that no household faced overwhelming hardship alone. At the same time, the repetitive, gentle motions of shared tasks fostered calm, a sense of order, and a subtle reassurance that life, though harsh in winter, was manageable. Even the simplest gestures, lifting a log, stirring a pot, brushing straw bedding, gained a meditative quality when done in the company of neighbors or kin. Repeated day after day in quiet, rhythmic patterns, by evening, as frost clung to window panes and the sun dipped below the horizon, families returned to their own hearths with a sense of accomplishment, rooted not in excitement, but in the completion of slow, careful labor. The shared work of winter, repetitive, quiet, and deliberate, formed a rhythm that regulated the village's life, reinforced relationships, and created subtle comfort. Survival was not merely about food or warmth. It was about continuity, shared effort, and the patient repetition of tasks that had been practiced for generations. Through the quiet cooperation of households, winter became more bearable, less lonely, and subtly hypnotic. The rhythm of shared labor, the steady cadence of chopping, stirring, carrying, mending, and observing was at once practical, soothing, and deeply human. In these slow, repeated actions, the village endured, sustaining both body and spirit until the first signs of spring appeared on frost-hardened fields. As the long nights of winter stretched on, the rhythm of family life shifted toward the evening. After hours spent tending fires, preparing food, mending clothing, and sharing labor with neighbors, the final hours of the day became a quiet, almost meditative period. These winter nights, long and still, were devoted to slow rituals and small acts that tied family members together and reinforced a sense of continuity, security, and comfort within the cold, dimly lit walls of the cottage. Evening preparations began softly, with the dimming of daylight signaling a subtle shift in household activity. Candles, made from tallow, were lit carefully, their weak glow barely illuminating wooden tables, benches, and the straw-covered floors. The hearth, central to both warmth and life, was replenished with logs arranged with the patient precision learned from months of careful stacking and drying. Each flicker of firelight traced the contours of walls lined with herbs, textiles, and stored food, forming gentle shadows that moved slowly across the room as though the house itself were breathing. Families often settled into repetitive, comforting tasks while the fire burned steadily. Parents might mend small tears in clothing or blankets, while children helped by holding patches, turning fabric, or arranging small bundles of kindling. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, stitch by stitch, bundle by bundle, each movement measured and almost hypnotic. There was a sense of safety in repetition. The slow cadence of familiar tasks provided reassurance that even in the coldest months, life remained orderly and survivable. Storytelling became a nightly ritual. Tales were seldom dramatic or adventurous. They were soft recollections of past seasons, quiet legends, or practical lessons about the village, the forest, and the household. Words were spoken in low tones, the rhythm slow and measured, sometimes accompanied by gestures tracing shapes in the air or tapping lightly on a wooden surface. Children listened with subdued attention, lulled not only by the content but by the gentle cadence of repetition and the warm presence of parents and elders. These stories reinforced the family's understanding of their environment, past winters, and the slow continuity of village life. Meal leftovers were carefully managed during these nights. Small pots of porridge, broth, or softened bread were warmed by the fire, portioned carefully, and set aside for early mornings or later meals. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb and drop served a purpose, a small but significant testament to the household's preparation and endurance. Even these simple acts of dividing food followed a deliberate rhythm, emphasizing the gentle order and predictability that made winter tolerable. Children's routines often merged with these adult tasks. They might brush straw bedding, arrange quilts, or fetch small bundles of firewood from nearby storage, their movements guided by observation and repeated practice. Their participation was slow, almost ceremonial in nature, reinforcing the household's shared rhythm. Even the quietest gestures, adjusting a blanket, stirring embers, folding a tunic, became integral to the evening's pattern, teaching responsibility while providing a hypnotic sense of continuity. Personal care continued at night, though with subtle restraint. Hands and faces were washed with small amounts of warm water, ointments applied to dry skin, and hair smoothed carefully. These simple, repeated acts were not hurried. They provided physical comfort and a quiet reassurance, marking the transition from the day's work to rest. Clothing and bedding were arranged meticulously, ensuring warmth and minimizing drafts. The repetition of these minor chores, performed with patience and calm, became almost meditative, helping the family settle into the long hours of darkness. Evening prayers or soft reflection were often included in these nightly rituals. Some families paused by the hearth, bowing heads or murmuring low words of thanks, while others simply sat in silence, listening to the crackle of embers and the faint wind against walls and windows. These pauses reinforced the rhythm of daily life and provided a moment of stillness, a subtle anchor that allowed all members to feel grounded and secure despite the harsh winter beyond the cottage walls. Finally, as the household gradually prepared for sleep, the slow, deliberate movements of the day converged into a single, unified rhythm. Children tucked under layered quilts, adults seated near the dying embers. The house seemed to exhale softly, enveloped in the quiet, hypnotic cadence of warmth, care, and repetition. The long winter night, though cold and dark, was softened by these rituals, providing not only physical comfort, but the subtle, enduring assurance that the family would survive until the light returned. Approximately equals 800 words, even after the main evening meal and quiet storytelling. Medieval households were not entirely idle. The long winter nights demanded continued care of both the home and its contents. Nighttime chores were slow, methodical, and repetitive, often performed in near silence, their gentle rhythm contributing as much to warmth and comfort as the fire itself. These tasks, while seemingly mundane, created a steady pattern that helped families endure the prolonged darkness and cold. One essential task involved tending the hearth through the night. Though the fire was often banked to burn more slowly, ashes were occasionally stirred, and small logs repositioned to maintain consistent warmth. Adults moved carefully, mindful of both the flames and the small children sleeping nearby. The sound of cracking embers, the faint scent of smoke, and the slow, steady motions of adding kindling provided a subtle reassurance, quiet reminder that the household's warmth and safety were maintained. Even as the night deepened, small adjustments to bedding were also a nightly routine. Quilts and blankets were fluffed, straw mattresses repositioned, and extra layers added where drafts were detected. Children, guided by parents, might help by arranging their own sleeping areas or gently patting the straw for even support. These repetitive actions were almost hypnotic, performed in near darkness with the occasional flicker of candlelight. Each motion was slow, deliberate, and quiet, fostering a calming rhythm that prepared both body and mind for sleep. Animals within or near the home also required attention. Chickens, goats, or even a dog might be fed or checked for warmth and security. Livestock in attached barns or pens were observed to ensure hay was sufficient. Water sources remained unfrozen and shelters were intact. Families moved slowly, their steps measured against frost-crusted floors and cold stone. The repetitive nature of these movements, from lifting buckets to adjusting bedding, contributed to the household's hypnotic nighttime rhythm. Even the simplest tasks became meditative when repeated consistently. Nighttime also offered an opportunity for small repairs. Clothing, tools, and kitchen utensils might be mended quietly while the fire crackled. Needles moved through woolen tunics. Wooden handles were tied or reinforced, and clay pots were carefully wiped or stored. These chores were done slowly, almost ritualistically, reinforcing both the care for material objects and the mental comfort of maintaining order. Every stitch or adjustment was an assurance that the family could rely on its possessions through the remainder of winter. Water management was another subtle responsibility. Wooden basins were replenished for the following morning. Small amounts of water saved for drinking or washing, and ice or frost on windows and doorways gently cleared. These movements were deliberate, ensuring that resources remained accessible without disrupting the fragile warmth inside the home. The quiet repetition of these routines contributed to a slow, hypnotic flow of activity that persisted even in the dark hours. The household's rhythm extended to observation and planning. Adults might silently note the state of firewood, the condition of stored food, or potential repairs needed in the near future. These mental checks were performed without urgency or stress, often while performing other repetitive tasks. The quiet mindfulness of observation became part of the nightly pattern, a slow, gentle preparation for the days to come. By the later hours of night, the household gradually settled into stillness. Fires smoldered with steady warmth, blankets were arranged in layers, and children slept peacefully. The repetitive chores, performed throughout the evening, had not only maintained comfort and safety, but also established a subtle rhythm that shaped perception of time and endurance. The long night, though dark and cold, was softened by the slow, measured cadence of household management, each gesture reinforcing the quiet continuity of family life. Through these nocturnal routines, medieval families created a delicate balance between activity and rest, labor and reflection. Nighttime chores were not hurried or loud. They were repetitive, predictable, and calming. They ensured survival, nurtured comfort, and reinforced the steady hypnotic pulse of winter pulse that persisted quietly until dawn, when the slow routines of the day would begin once more. After hours of careful tending to fires, meals, clothing, and animals, medieval families finally embraced the long, quiet period of rest, the culmination of daily and nightly routines so deliberate, repetitive, and slow was sleep, the one uninterrupted rhythm that carried them through the darkest months. Winter sleep was not merely an escape from cold and labor. It was the final act in a series of measured, comforting routines, a way to anchor both body and mind against the long, frosty nights. The family's final preparations began with the hearth. The fire was banked carefully, leaving enough embers to provide gentle warmth through the night. Logs were stacked nearby for easy access in case the fire waned. The soft glow of embers illuminated the modest furnishings, highlighting straw mattresses, thick quilts, and woolen clothing laid out for each member. The slow, deliberate motions of tending the hearth were almost meditative, a final act that ensured safety, warmth, and the continuity of the household's rhythm. Children were tucked carefully under layers of blankets and quilts, their small bodies arranged to maximize insulation. Parents adjusted their own bedding, smoothing straw, folding woolen layers, and ensuring that clothing worn to bed provided both warmth and comfort. Every movement was measured and quiet, part of a nightly ritual that had been repeated across countless winters. The gentle cadence of these actions created a sense of calm, a soft reassurance that the household was ready to endure the long night. Small sounds marked the final minutes before sleep, the crackle of embers, the soft rustle of blankets, and the occasional whisper of a child or parent ensuring comfort. These sounds, far from disturbing rest, contributed to the hypnotic rhythm of winter life. The household moved in a quiet choreography, each member performing familiar gestures with care and precision, reinforcing the sense of order and safety that had been built throughout the day. The room's atmosphere, dimly lit by residual embers and flickering candlelight, fostered a subtle sense of tranquility. Shadows stretched and shifted slowly across walls, and the faint scent of herb sage, rosemary, thyme lingered in the air. These scents, combined with warmth, soft bedding, and the comforting presence of family, created a gentle environment conducive to deep rest. Medieval families understood that even the coldest nights could be endured more easily when sleep followed the rhythm of careful preparation. During these final moments, families often reflected quietly, not in words, but through the repetitive gestures of tending their own spaces, adjusting blankets, smoothing clothing, checking on animals, or simply watching the fire die down, were all part of a meditative pattern. The repetition of small, deliberate movements reinforced calm, provided reassurance, and allowed minds to settle. In this way, sleep became less of a passive state and more a continuation of the household's structured rhythm, an essential link in the chain of survival. Through winter, the long winter nights themselves contributed to the hypnotic quality of rest. Darkness extended for many hours, and with it came the gentle acceptance of stillness. Families adapted to the natural rhythm of night and day, rising with the faintest light of dawn to continue their slow, deliberate routines. In between, sleep provided recovery, warmth, and the subtle mental comfort of routine. It was in this repetition, the quiet rhythm of tending, preparing, and resting that survival was ensured, not only for the body, but for the mind and the household as a whole. By the early hours of morning, The household's calm was complete. The fire smoldered, blankets cocooned sleeping bodies, and the stillness of the night reigned. Each day's labor, carefully performed and repeated, had culminated in a restorative sleep, providing both physical warmth and mental stability. The quiet routines of evening, night, and finally rest created a continuous cycle that carried families through even the harshest of winters with patience, resilience, and subtle comfort. The long winter sleep, supported by careful preparation and deliberate routines, was more than a nightly necessity. It was a central part of medieval life, a slow, enduring rhythm that shaped the experience of cold, dark months. Through the repetition of chores, the quiet tending of hearths and animals, the gentle care of clothing and bedding, and the measured sharing of time and space with family, medieval households found continuity, reassurance, and rest. In these long, silent hours, the pulse of domestic life continued steadily, unhurried and meditative, a soft cadence that carried families safely through the depths of winter.